Mendocino Institute and a past fellow in environmental history at the University of California, Berkeley. He was trained at Antioch College and Warwick University, where he studied under the direction of the late Edward Thompson. After Warwick, he worked as a warehouse man, truck driver, and journalist as a participant in and observer of the 1970s Breaking Workers' Rebellion in the U.S. He was a professor of labor studies at the Center for Worker Education, City College in New York. He was a visiting senior lecturer at the Northern College for Residential Adult Education in South Yorkshire. His most recent book is River of Fire, Commons, Crisis, and the Imagination. We also have Keith McHenry. While at Boston University, McHenry became active in anti-nuclear power protests. He began to organize actions in cities on the east coast of the United States against nuclear arms war, while promoting alternative energy and organic gardening. In 1980, he and others started the first food not bombs chapter in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In the following years, Keith was arrested over 100 times for serving free food in city parks and spent over 500 nights in jail. He faced 25 years to life in prison under the California Three Strikes Law, but in 1995, Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Commission brought about his release. In 2012, he founded the Food Not Bombs Free School, which teaches a summer course covering social issues, community organizing, nonviolent social change, cultural events, and sustainable agriculture. And finally, we have Vlad Gozic. Vlad Gozic is a literary critic, literary theorist, translator, and scholar. He is attributed with influencing the conceptualization of modern literature and critical studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Through his work at the University of Minnesota Press in the 1980s, Gozic brought important works of critical theory into English translation. His essays during this period were well received by critics, as they were among the first to link deconstruction, cultural criticism, and third-world literature questions. So, as I'm sure you all know, this panel is on the events of 1968. Now, for half a century, 1968 has represented a high-water mark of social and political transformation, a year of social upheaval that spanned the entire globe. Ushered in by a new left that sought to distinguish itself from the old left that emerged in the 20s and 30s, the monumental events of 1968 set the tone for everything from protest politics to academic leftism. Today, with the U.S. entangled in a seemingly endless war in the Middle East and people calling for the impeachment of an unpopular president, with activists fighting in the streets and calling for liberation along the lines of race, gender, and sexuality, the left's every attempt to discover new methods and new ideas seems to invoke a memory of the political horizons of 1968. We perhaps more than ever feel the urgency of the question, what lessons can be drawn from the new left, as in our generation undertakes a project of building the left of the 21st century. So now we'll have some opening statements from each panelist. They'll receive 10 minutes each to make their statements.
I want to go so far. Can you hear back there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, since I feel that I'm a little bit of an outlier here, maybe it's fitting that I speak first, because then you can forget what I've said and concentrate on what others will say. Let me start with a personal note. 1968 was, for me, a rather interesting year because I found myself in a number of places where things were happening, and this was per chance, though I had difficulty convincing some cops in Denver, Colorado in August that this was per chance. I was in Poland in March when the March events took place there, which had to do with a play that is a classical play that the Russian authorities were not, the Soviet authorities I should say, but these were Russians, because the line in the play was about Russians, not Soviets. It was a 19th century play. They weren't happy about it, so they tried to ban it, and 10,000 students showed up, and then goons showed up, and people beat each other up, and they tried to bring down a statue. And so what's interesting about that is that among the people who were there, the students, were then 10 years later leaders of Solidarność, and more recently they are still in very important oppositional politics, so that there is a kind of an interesting aftermath to this. In March, I saw events in the south of France and in Italy at La Sapienza, where there were a great many demonstrations. I was in Berlin when Rudi Dutschke was shot. He was the head of the German socialist student movement, and had been really a very important person in organizing that movement. And again, there were a number of people who came out of that movement eventually. Uh, I was in Paris during the May events and managed to get out by the last flight just in time to come to Columbia, where I was ostensibly a student, to take part in the closing down of Columbia University. Later, I was in Prague when the tanks rolled in, and I was getting ready to go to Chicago in October when I was notified by two gentlemen who had FBI cards that I was going to spend the month of October in Puerto Rico. I was not allowed to be on the mainland during that period of time, which was, not a bad thing because Puerto Rican television covered the events in Mexico in early October far better than they were covered here. Here, they only covered the Olympics. There, they covered the killings prior to the Olympics. I mentioned this because what I recall mostly is that all of those events seemed disjointed to me at the time. That is, there was not a particular thread to them. Each one was occurring for local reasons with people who had their own reasons to do it. I skipped over actually being involved in a race riot in Denver, which is when I was arrested by the cops, and they actually then decided after they had taken my whole history that I was one of those international agitators, and especially because I was stateless at that time. So this certainly conformed to their idea. And worse than that, since I was working as an escort interpreter for the State Department, and they were John Birch Society members, they had proof in my person that the communists had controlled the State Department and were organizing these riots all over the world. It was very interesting to have that conversation with them. Because they, you see, believed that all of those things were interrelated, that they were caused by some kind of mastermind organizing these things across. But they were not. They were not. And what was interesting is that a number of local factors melded together with larger frameworks that were affecting much of society. And I'll mention just a few as I understand them. Uh, First and foremost, 1968 was the time when there was a break with the immediate post-war period. Up until the early 60s, you were really in Europe in particular, but also in Japan and in Brazil and so on, you were still in the wake of World War II. There was a great deal of rebuilding, and that was the focus. And for some people, especially in this country, there was a kind of an easy passage from World War II to the Cold War. That was not the case in other places. The second thing that was important was demographics. You had a huge surge of young people, and these young people were getting an education, universities were being opened, programs were being opened, and the one thing that they realized is that what was being taught to them was not related to their reality. And this is where you had all over slogans like don't trust authority and don't believe it and innovate and invent and liberate and free. And there was the influence of the third world liberation movements that was taking part in that. And but what happened in all of those places always had, it seemed to me, at least three dimensions. One, and the one that was the most visible one, and is the one that is probably retained most by people, was a cultural transformation, that it was a kind of a cultural revolution. And it was visible in all kinds of ways. It will be very difficult to convince you, except for my friends on the panel here, that up until 1968, people didn't talk to each other. There was hardly any conversation that was really taking place. People talked down or up to somebody, but they were actually staying within certain kinds of parameters. In all the places that I mentioned, the events were marked by spontaneous outbursts of endless conversations that went on day and night for several days, and that created a particular kind of an atmosphere where suddenly everything that had been repressed was being stated, and all kinds of stupid things were being said, but stupid things have the right to be said instead of being repressed uh, as well. The second dimension was a social revolution, an attempt to create a social revolution. By social revolution, I mean revisiting and changing the organizations of struggles that had taken place until then, which were basically workers' struggles, workplace, organized around unions, and so on. Suddenly, you have all kinds of unexpected actors coming up on the scene, and these were, of course, racial minorities, immigrants, students, eventually women, and so on and so forth. You're all familiar with that. The third one was the one that was perhaps most difficult to track, but it was quite important, and that is that people were struggling with trying to define what should be a political order, what kind of democracy would we have. And of course, this is where the big break occurred between those who advocated what they called liberal democracy, and which was something that was called liberal democracy for a long time, versus those who knew already then that liberal democracy was a sham, that it would not work. And if I jump to the present period, it seems to me that that is where the connection is. That is, the connection is that the notion that a liberal democracy is a working democracy is no longer believed by anyone except maybe a few editorial writers on Washington Post and New York Times who invoke it as a kind of a mantra because they can't think of anything else. But the, uh, the, the notion that liberalism and democracy are wedded and are producing the best link is something that was first challenged during that period and now is no longer tenable in any possible way. And so the question of what kind of democracy, and over a period of time, there was a great deal of debate, and there continues to be debates about what kind of democracy, socialist democracy, or humanist democracy, and so on, and whether, in fact, the very word democracy is one that one should hold on to. And this is where I don't want to talk too long, but where these challenges were appropriated one by one. The cultural revolution was appropriated by capitalism, which said very simply, you want individual freedom, we're all in favor of individual freedom, you're going to be free members of the market. That's what you're going to make you free, you will recognize your freedom. The social one was captured by things around notions of multiculturalism and communitarianism. And the third one is has seen a movement that is very powerful right now toward new forms of authoritarianism, which is actually the people who are saying we're done with democracy, democracy does not work, we need authority, and you have Xi Jinping praising Trump and Trump praising Putin, and creating a circle in which people like Erdogan and others are all very happy to be part of, and others saying, how do we join that particular thing? And so it seems to me that those three things have had both their positive but also their deleterious aspect. And, uh, and I want to finish on this note. I don't think that 1968 is over. It was an important moment, and moments like that, like the French Revolution, the, the industrial revolutions, they mature over a period of time. And I think that now we could say, from my perspective, that 1968 is entering into its mature form. And it is not, and it is for this reason that this year is an important one, because it is this time, to borrow a phrase, it's time to get rid of the infantile aspects of 1968 and really focus on what its maturity can bring to us. So I'll stop on that because otherwise I'll talk on it.
Go ahead. Can you hear me all right? Do I need the microphone? Can you hear me? Take a bit of a different track here. In 1968, really in the late 60s, one thing that was observed not on the campuses, but in the workplaces, was the beginning of what came to be called a rank and file rebellion. And basically, rank and file meaning that it was rebellion that took place within the working class and the organized labor movement from the bottom up. It was not a movement that was led by the established union leaders who were quite strong, powerful at the time. And it was a movement which was characterized by what we call wildcat strikes, or strikes that were illegal, strikes that violated contracts, strikes that went against the rules of the leaderships of the organizations that were involved. And I wanted to point really just to one of these revolts. Maybe there'll be some questions about some of the others. But in the context of what perhaps is not so well remembered about this period, but in 1970 and 1974, there were two of the largest strike waves in the history of the United States, where in each year there were more than 5,000 strikes. And in each year, millions of ordinary people, of ordinary Americans, went on strike. And this, of course, was in the period of Nixon, and relatively, compared to today, reactionary government. So in this context, let me say that it's interesting, you might want to think about things this way, that amongst the biggest winners of the 1960s, and there were winners and losers, but amongst the biggest winners were the teachers. And I say this thinking about the events in West Virginia, and I think we should pay attention to what's been going on over the past weekend in West Virginia. But what happened amongst the teachers was that there was something like a 10-year strike wave, a 10-year organizing, striking and organizing period of time. And the teachers' unions, and there were two of them, the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers, the teachers turned teachers into the biggest unions in the country, surpassing the industrial unions, which had been created really in the 1930s, surpassing them quite dramatically in this period of time. So that the National Education Association, which was hardly even a union when the period began, grew by 100,000 members a year in the 1970s. Now that's, I think, if you followed, modern labor movements at all, that's quite a staggering figure, 100,000. And the National Education Association became the largest by far and remains the largest by far trade union in the United States. And what about this? Well, I think the thing that I wanted to ask you to think about was this, that this whole movement was led by young people, especially it was led by young women. It was young people who came out of the universities in the 1960s, and they were touched by the 1960s in a way I think that we might miss if we continue to concentrate on SDS and a number of very marginal organizations and movements during the time. So these young people, however, who broke the law, violated contracts, you go to jail for these things. You could lose your job if you violate your contract. So these young people, what was behind them? What inspired them? Well, it seems to me that they were inspired by the bigger movements, which I think were in some ways universal, I would say, of the 1960s. And that is a belief that democracy involved participation, a belief in equal rights, and especially coming from the impact of the civil rights movement, the rights of Black people, African American people, and amongst teachers, especially women's rights. And once again, something which I think held the movement of the 1960s together, that is the international movement against the Vietnam War, which seemed to me impacted everything that happened in the 1960s. Now, that's just one movement, but a movement which had a very deep and lasting effect on our society. And I think if you followed the West Virginia teachers, you would hear them referring back to the Battle of Blair Mountain when it was some miners actually led an armed revolt and ended up in a battle which they lost with the US Army. But they don't need to, and they don't need to think back that far, because in the 1960s and 70s, there was also a revolt amongst the miners in the miners' union, where they threw out a typically 1950s reactionary, thuggish leadership which was willing to murder its opponents, formed an organization called the Miners for Democracy, democracy very much part of one of the mantras of the 1960s, and opened up the coal fields into a strike wave, part of this bigger strike wave, but a strike wave which has hardly ever been seen before, so that there were more than 1,000 strikes in the coal fields, meaning the Appalachian coal fields, in the 1970s. So I think that what's going on today, these teachers don't have to look back so far. They can look back to that. And for us to understand these people talking about coal miners and Blair Mountain and their families and so forth, we have to understand that it's undoubtedly true that in an area like that, a former industrial area like that, probably everybody in there had someone in their family who'd been on a strike, who'd been in jail, who'd lost their job because of a sacrifice like this. So in that sense, I think there's a certain depth to this movement, which I think is hopeful. Just a couple of other ideas of things that were going on. We could talk about a movement in the automobile industry, in the steel industry, in the trucking industry. There was a movement which was organized called the Coalition of Labor Union Women, which is an extremely interesting and promising movement that was started in 1974. And thinking about these things again from looking at this kind of a bigger picture, you find interesting. You ever heard of Studs Terkel? Have you ever heard of him? He wrote he did interviews with ordinary American people. He's dead now. But he called this rank and file rebellion the New Left. A truck driver who I had the pleasure of meeting one time named Paul Deach. He was, we don't have these things anymore, but he was called a steel hauler. And he carried big rolls of steel from the mills to the auto plants. And he called the steel haulers, he said, well, we're the Black Panthers of the working class. That was his way of understanding that the situation that they were in. We still have United Parcel Workers in Detroit, Michigan. A group of them formed UPRUM, which was the United Parcel Revolutionary Union movement, which was named after Drum, which was the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement. So I think it's interesting to think about all of these sorts of things. I was going to read out David Montgomery, if any of you have done any labor history, the late David Montgomery, you may know of him. Going back to teachers, and then I'll quit. He's one of our outstanding historians. He called what was beginning in the 60s a new unionism. And he said the sight in 1968 of school teachers, hospital workers, garbage men, like those King was addressing, garbage men going off to jail for for violating injunctions is becoming routine. The teachers are demonstrating that arbitrary authority is as common and as intolerable in education hierarchies as it is in the factories. And then another thing, which is not just about teachers, but I think gives us an idea of what was going on, and this is in the middle of the 70s, there was a very large nurses' strike in Seattle. 2,500 nurses went on strike, and a bemused New York Times reporter said this about them: their issues were wages and staffing and agency shop. This is all what's going on. You might know that since today. He said that, well, that's what the issues were, wages and so forth. But there was an emotional issue, typically, he would say. According to a doctor, he says, it used to be that nurses could be yelled at and their opinions ignored. Now they will challenge doctors and sometimes even substitute their judgment for his. This is the issue of parity, brought by the smart young nurses who have recently graduated and sparked the women's movement that is making it so hard to end this strike. My point being, who were these people? Where did they come from? They were not SDS members, but they came out of the universities in that period of time.
Okay. So I lived in rural Virginia in the late 60s. And in our town, we desegregated our schools in 1966. And what the way they handled that was that they just determined that all the people from the west side of the tracks, which would be the African American people, had Down syndrome and put them in special education. So that is happening at a time when there is all this other uprisings happening. We had signs in our community that said no Jews allowed in all the stores, even though there's only one Jewish family in our town who actually built City Hall. But and you could buy colored-only signs at the Benjamin or the Five and Dime downtown that were manufactured. All that was going on, and yet just about an hour and a half drive from there was Washington, D.C., where there was huge protest. And on occasion, I would get the opportunity to go to some of the giant protests that were happening mostly against the Vietnam War. And then I was extremely influenced by a family vacation, which happened to start out in D.C. with huge riots and smoke coming out of the city, tanks on the streets, massive amounts of helicopters in the air, bringing troops into the mall and into area around the Capitol building. And drove past Baltimore, which was on fire, and you could see all the smoke rising out of Baltimore. And then spent the evening in a riot in Philadelphia with troops on the streets shooting at people. And the hotel that we stayed in was wood, and buildings near us were burning down. And our family was the only white family in an African-American community that was under siege by the military. And so those are some of the things that immediately influenced me in my directly that I saw. And for example, also in 66 and 67, we had mandatory Christian education in our school. And my parents thought that was not legal, it was not legal, and spoke out about that. And the Parents Teachers Association came out to our house with rocks and torches and attacked our family's home as a result of questioning the logic of mandatory Pentecostal Christian education. And that's what's happening directly to me, but I really was excited about what I was hearing and seeing in the larger world. And in particular for me, I was impressed by the May actions in Paris in 1968, and specifically the campaign of young people coming up with slogans and images, making posters, going out at night and meat pasting them all over the city, and a kind of visual and shorthand conversation about what events were going on in the May strikes of '68. And that's how I entered activism, was as a graphic designer, as a poster maker, as somebody that went out and did graffiti and glued posters all over the city, and of Boston in my case, where I finally eventually landed. And I felt the cultural aspect of street theater, of music, of rock, of dressing. If you can imagine in 1966 in my school, if you got caught with your shirt untucked, you would get whipped with a board. And that was kind of the level of resistance that high school kids were going through. And there was kind of even a dress code uprising happening in my high school, because of you have to be proper in all these ways, including always having your shirt tucked in, and just little tiny things like that, which today don't, it just seems ridiculous that was such a huge volatile way of resisting authority. But it was a whole energy of resisting authority, even at that small level. And I tend to agree that the '68 is continuing now. But what I see, because I organize on the streets every day, is that there's very many similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And one of the things I think is actually quite exciting about right now, although it's also painful that in its reality, is the fact that rather than the government and the authorities being able to diffuse student rebellions by ending the draft and having it be an all-volunteer army, pulling out of Vietnam, scandals of Nixon and so on, people, I find, because we have a shared poverty, economic struggle that doesn't go away instantly. It's not like everyone can have a lot of money and be at ease and not worry about their rent and have affordable housing and a high-paying job and everything like that. It seems to keep more and more people in protest, and it's not so easy to just turn off like a mass movement. So while it's not necessarily yet a mass movement, I think it has some conditions that could possibly spark a much larger rebellion, similar to what happened with the Vietnam War and the civil rights and so on at this time. But there's also another thing I find interesting. When I was like a young activist in high school and college, we had our mentors. I took American history with Howard Zinn. There was people like that in our community, and older people like that even in our political organizations. But now I find that the many people that were active in the '60s, and there's like a huge number of people that were active in the '60s that are now coming out of retirement from mainstream jobs. And their knowledge of what they recall from that time is something that really could be an asset to a massive young generation of people who, as we see, are walking out because of gun violence, Black Lives Matter actions, other types of protest movements that are going on, this teacher strike that just happened. So there's, I think, some hopefulness in that there's almost a compression of generational information, and that a lot of the features of society that existed when the rebellions of '68 were happening have just continued along and are maturing, and that there's a very good chance that there'll be a much more sophisticated, smart, intelligent way of responding to what I think particularly is going to be a massive economic hit on middle America and then on the world, which is already happening. Another thing I've noticed in most, that is, I'm not sure exactly what will happen out of this, But I would watch, like, if you watch the news, you'll see like all these people under blue tarps with like cardboard boxes and so on, trying to survive. And if you don't know that it's the Middle East or Africa or Europe or the United States, it has the same kind of look of this underclass of refugees, like we call them homeless here in the United States, and just internally displaced people that is sweeping the world. Now the thing is that people are generally just in that condition, trying to survive, just to get food, just to eat, just to live, just to resist the police. But in the example in the past couple of days, since they cleared the Benchlands campground over at San Lorenzo Park, all kinds of people living on the streets have been coming to me saying they're going to start resisting, and they're cobbling together plans to fight back against this repression that is happening in Santa Cruz. And that's coming from them. This is coming from the poorest of the people in the streets who quite literally have nothing more to lose, since during the past couple of weeks, all their belongings have been taken and destroyed. And I don't know if there's any kind of like organized effort that could be focused and made into unity between that and people that are working for rent control and for all these layers. If there's any kind of solidarity between those with houses and those without houses, there could be a very, very serious momentum throughout the United States to really change things. You see like some aspects. This is the 50th anniversary of King's Poor People's March. There's an effort to try to recreate or to step up and do that for real, since it was cut short by his assassination. So there is and things are happening very, very quickly. So but it is like not as centralized as was first pointed out, like a dictator somewhere is having all the activists go out and protest or something. That's what's commonly thought of in the bipolar world of communism and capitalism of the 60s. Now there's no that doesn't exist. It's really poor people versus oligarchs, and that's the division that is currently occurring.
Right. Now we'll be moving to the segment of each panelist will have about 3 minutes to respond to the statements of the others.
One of the things that is different, I think, today from what we had in the 1960s, and that is that in the 1960s, you mobilized people primarily around the notion of freedom and the notion of liberation. Those were the things that really motivated people. And what had been pushed into the background at that time, even though a lot of people were aware of it, was the question of equality and justice. And I think that today we see that divorcing the discussion of freedom from notions of equality and of justice is a very major mistake, that you cannot, in fact, talk about those things. Freedom without those then makes you simply a play of the market. You have to have an understanding of what equality means and how to negotiate this kind of equality at all levels. And I want to point out sometimes the disjunction that exists between some things that happen here in this country, but even on this campus to other places. I've taught in many places. One of the most conservative universities that I've taught at was the University of Geneva. It was founded by Calvin, so you can imagine, what its outlook was. And so when I came here, people told me, now you're happy, you're going to be in a progressive university. Well, at the University of Geneva, when I was chair of my department, the Department of Comparative Literature, we had a steering committee that was composed of 2 faculty members, 2 undergraduates, 1 graduate, and 1 staff person. We met and made all of the decisions by the steering committee, which had control over everything except the hiring of professors. And that was because that was in the constitution that Calvin had written. The budget, the curriculum was all decided by that steering committee, and the students consulted with each other. Here, where are the students? Where is the consultation? Where is that kind of a democracy? It doesn't exist. In fact, in most departments, you have a small oligarchy of people who make those decisions and inform the assistant professors. But this is, after all, a very progressive place, as opposed to very conservative Switzerland and Geneva. It's one of the examples. And I could give you examples from other places where I taught at the University of Montreal. At the University of Montreal, the faculty was unionized, the students were unionized and are unionized to this very day, so that actually the students negotiate with the administration and with the government over fees. And if they don't like it, they strike. And one strike lasted 18 months because they were not in agreement over all kinds of issues. So there are forms of activity that we are not aware of because of the narrowness of our scope. And one of the things that I would really urge everyone in this room is to actually inform yourself not only about those things that happen in this country, but around the world. There is a lot that's going on there, and there is a lot that we can learn, but also where we can actually act in solidarity with each other. Because the moment that you invoke justice and equality, you have to invoke solidarity. The French had, for their revolution, had, liberté, égalité, fraternité. Fraternité is a nonsense idea. After all, brothers kill each other all the time, so that does not work very well. But solidarity is a very, very different notion and much more important. And actually, at the time of the solidarity movement in Poland, Solidarność, which has been the largest movement in a country since it involved 40% of the population at one time being out on the streets. Solidarity was an extremely important notion. But we don't have a theoretical description of solidarity. And one of the things that we who are within universities need to do is not that we can be good activists. We are there to provide intellectual tools and to create intellectual tools that then activists can use.
Well, I think that perhaps one thing that's being left out here is I mentioned it, but I'll mention it again, the importance of the Vietnam War and the movement against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. And I think one thing to say about that is that it was a movement that built up over a decade's time, and it was an international movement, and it began with small groups like this on campuses around the world, and deeply influenced every other movement that came along in that period. And so it seems to me that it's the spark of the French Revolt of '68 was anti-Vietnam. The big demonstrations in London in 1968, the big attacks on Grosvenor Square and so forth, were anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. So that's one thing that needs to be said. Also internationally, but especially here in the United States, the civil rights movement was a movement which built up over a decade. These were movements which didn't just kind of drop in and disappear. For a student, say you're an undergraduate here this evening, you might spend 3 or 4 years at college going around dorms arguing with other students about the Vietnam War, handing out literature, starting out with very minor demonstrations, sit-ins, and so forth. So, of course, the Vietnam War was extremely important in what we called back then the Third World, the whole rest of the world, which saw what the United States was doing in Vietnam. So it seems to me that that's something that's very important in terms of centering what we want to talk about in the period. And in the United States, the civil rights movement, which once again was, if you'd been a student here in the 1960s, you undoubtedly would have, the people here tonight, some of you would have been a member of the Santa Cruz Committee to End Racial Discrimination or something of that sort. And a movement that lasted a long time. So I think that those are two important things that that have to be part of it. They're very concrete, they're very real, they involve real activity of millions of people. The other thing that I want to say about the 1960s is that part of the discussion of the 1960s was a discussion about agency. And by agency, the issue was, if things are going to change in society, if things are going to change in the world, how is it going to happen? Who's going to do it? So agency meaning who's going to do it. And so there were prolonged and sometimes unfriendly debates in the movements of young people all around the world about agency. Some people thought, well, there'd be student revolutionaries. Other people thought that the revolution would take place in the third world, and or that it would be led by the Soviet Union. So the question of agency was very important in this country. It not surprisingly came down to a question of the working class. That is the people who are the majority of Americans. What kind of a role were they playing? Could they possibly play? Would we expect them to play? Had things changed from the days of Marx and Engels and or the days of the socialist upsurge of the 1920s or 30s? One of the primary debates, and it's the debate in many ways that blew up SDS, was about agency and about the role of the working class in society. Now, it seemed to me that one of the biggest problems confronting young people in thinking about the working class was the problem of elitism that is part and parcel of all of. I've been involved in institutions like this. They're all, not pointing fingers. They're all elitist institutions, and they represent the elites of the society that we're in. And so there's a tremendous bias built into the very nature of these institutions against ordinary people, against working class people, I would say in particular. So I don't believe that it's resolved right now, the question of agency, but I do think that anyone who thinks about democracy has to think about, well, who are the majority of people? What would democracy look like? We ask that question, and the majority of people still in the advanced industrial countries, but also in China and so forth, are people who work for wages, people who, in the old definitions of the socialist movements, would be called working class. They're exploited by other people, they work for wages.
Well, I think this period that we're in right now is quite challenging. I think that there was a ability in part in the 60s to try to shape actions and ideas based on pretty clear ideological understandings of people, being educated. I know for myself, I was really inspired by Mao's Art and Revolution, and there would be that kind of thing with all these conversations about how to move forward. Now, because the technology, social media, the whole way society is organized, the challenges of the environment, which are like extreme, and the poverty, which is growing and growing, how to actually, what to influence what. So there's is there influencing politicians to change policies that will make a difference in people's lives, or is it something that we have to do ourselves to create our own society, separate from failing and collapsing governmental system? And I think probably like many people, the news of like the craziest possible things of, say, the Trump administration or some Republicans, or what you hear like in in the mainstream media about Democrat and Republican Party fights and all this stuff. Where do we fit in as people on the grassroots, on the ground level, trying to really form a future that is more than just survivable, but that is actually a future where we can flourish and our ideas and self-esteem and dignity flourish. And it's very, very challenging. But one thing, so when I was, when I was young, like a high school, college student, you would think, okay, the next big protest will be the one that stops the Vietnam War, or the next big thing. And one of the lessons I learned is that it's an issue of doing something over and over and over again for decades and decades with some basic analysis of how it's going to, what your philosophical background is, what your goals are, those kind of things, and to be there for the long run rather than just all mobilized for this one day and then all mobilized again for another day, but to be steady and in society with the people who are being impacted by the negative effects of capitalism, and to build relationships, build community, really, and to listen to what the people on the ground are saying, rather than a vanguard party that's got the ideas that's going to impose them on the future. I think things are so complex and so up in the air and so potentially dangerous that it's good for us to have a two-way conversation with everyone that's affected and to participate in that dialogue, try to influence the ideas and the conversation on the streets. And so Food Not Bombs has been out on the streets for, it'll be 38 years this May, plugging along, bringing out food, trying to create a space for dialogue of people who are not coming to these forums, are not going to protest. They're the average people walking by, and trying to invite them into just considering a different world. And we don't like try to impose a specific idea, but obviously we ask the question, should we be more concerned about things like food and our well-being, housing, real security, of those kinds of things? Would we make decisions as a community to make sure every one of us is fed and housed and clothed and educated? Or would we make a decision as a community to take all of our resources and use them for police and war and violence and just the general protection of the super rich?
So now we'll be opening the forum to questions from the audience. Anyone's welcome to come up with a question after polls.
This is a question for Mr. Godzich. How would you describe the legacy of 1968 for Central and Eastern Europe, who did not have the chance to express perhaps feelings of youth revolution until the late 80s and early 90s?
Well, actually, that's not quite true. There was a significant amount of activity among young people in the 1960s and particularly in 1968. And the three countries that had major flare-ups were Poland, Czechoslovakia at that time, and Yugoslavia. You had strikes, you had occupations of universities, and you had very major acts of repression, which were not quite of the same nature, because the way that things were precipitated were quite different. And so in Poland, it was around nationalist issues, so that it was there because national history was not being taught in the way that people knew that history. The Poles, of course, were very familiar with this because they had been partitioned for over 100 years, and so they had to maintain basically underground schools in which they taught what they were doing. And between 1968 and the eruption of the solidarity movement, which was a workers' movement with student supporting, there was this period where they were calling there was something they were calling flying universities, which were illegal universities that were where things were being taught, but also where materials were being produced and so on, with a number of scholars who had been expelled because following the events of May 1968 in Poland, the government expelled 250,000 people, mostly university instructors and others, and mostly accusing them of being Zionist supporters, and so they were given one-way visas outside of the country and were left. In the Czech Republic, it was or in Czechoslovakia, it was a different kind of a movement because the slogan of that movement, starting in the spring, it was known as the Prague Spring, was socialism with a human face, and so that drew out of the de-Stalinization that was taking place in in Yugoslavia. In Czechoslovakia, and so people like Dubka and others were in fact trying to say, no, it is possible to adopt a reformist approach to this. In Yugoslavia, they gathered around a discussion of agency, specifically with the creation of a journal that was called Praxis, which in fact had to do with who is going to be the agent. And one of the major issues for debate was who is a Yugoslav, since Yugoslavs at that time were assigned certain kind of identities. You were Croat, you were Serb, and so on. But interestingly enough, if you were in Bosnia Herzegovina, you were treated as a Muslim, not because you were a religious Muslim, but because that was supposed to be your ethnicity. So, in fact, if you went to Sarajevo, you would run into people who would say, well, I'm a Jewish Muslim, or I'm an Orthodox Muslim, or I'm a Catholic Muslim, which confused the hell out of people in other parts of the world. But that was going on there very much in that way. What was most interesting is that a lot of younger people, especially the people around that journal Praxis, were advocating a different identity, which they called generic Yugoslav. That is, shedding these remnants of the Austro-Hungarian Empire classification by national groups. And that's what fell apart with the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, when historians, and it's really historians, professors of history at the University of Zagreb, at the University of Belgrade, at the University of Sarajevo, who revived conflicts that were 450, 500-year-old. Thucydides writes at the very beginning of his history, I want to recall these events that took place, but I do not want to light the flames under the passions that were under those events. In Yugoslavia, they did the opposite. They lit up the passions, and then and that's why so many people died. Now, what we have is an interesting situation, and that is that in all of those places, you have very conservative governments that are authoritarian, that are attempting to and managing to control the judiciary system, the school system, and the young people are being relatively marginalized. So if you look, for example, in Poland, where is the opposition? Well, it still is in the theater. The plays that they're putting on at the present time and the kind of support there is unbelievable. I mean, there was one where the government was trying to revive the blasphemy law because they created a very, very large statue of the Pope, the Polish Pope John Paul II, and then they had short actresses who were dressed up as children and were giving the Pope blowjobs because that was the way of describing his silence on the pedophilia in the church. The government, of course, was outraged, and all kinds of people were outraged, but they could not stop it. And in fact, that play is touring. And so it's no longer in Warsaw or Krakow, but it's actually in places like Bydgoszcz or Torun, small places, and so on. And you have similar kinds of things going at certain level. Hungary, which is probably the country that has moved the furthest to the right, because basically the government in power is a fascistic government, and it has an extreme right Nazi party as it being its supporter. That party just lost an election in the town where it was founded, because the people in that town, started by high school kids, but others going from door to door, mobilized the people, and the government was just totally surprised by what happened, because they said, this is a Fidesz town, how could it be anyway? Those are kids, what do they know, you know? Just like, you know, we have people talking about the so-called kids in Florida, right? And they are now in a state of panic, so much so that they're actually looking and saying, next year's elections need to be postponed because we need to prepare, you know, a better way of doing it. And you have similar phenomena going on in several other places. You know, clearly there were antecedents that were very important. The war in Vietnam absolutely was a unifier of all of these movements, but there were the decolonization war in France, but also in Italy and so on. The war in Algeria was actually in many ways a preparation for the war in Vietnam. For the French, the war in Vietnam was old hand. They had lost it in 1954, you know. And they had the draft at that time, but they just had lost in Algeria, and that was the one that Sartre and others were mobilizing against. So yes, there were protests against the war in Vietnam, but the war in Vietnam was more a protest against the polarization within Europe that the United States in that time was trying to achieve, mostly leading to Reagan trying to place nuclear weapons on the ground in Germany, which did not sit very well with the Germans, because those nuclear weapons were short-term weapons, and they were basically meant to wipe out Germany because they expected that invasion to take place. But that's what the student movements were organizing around at that time. And so I'm sorry for a very long answer, but I think that if you look at all of the places in Eastern and Central Europe at the present time, you will see that there is actually a very important movement, but it does not percolate. We'll hear about it when it will have actually achieved a certain level. Just like, you know, we heard about the Arab Spring when it was in full sway, but it had been in preparation for a long time, just like the 10-year preparation that you were talking about earlier. These things are in preparation. So these things are going on. The only other thing that I would want to add, which we have not mentioned, is the importance of Latin America during this particular period. Cuba was extremely important in mobilizing people and understanding who they were. Che Guevara was an iconic figure of that particular time, and the fights against the dictatorships, in particular in Brazil, but also in Uruguay at that time, were really quite important, and people were very much aware of them.
Yeah. Okay, but like I was mentioning here, it's anyone can answer the question. It's both you and Vlad and Calvin, you guys both in your introduction, you talked about the group of people in 1960, the different groups of people questioning liberal democracy, and then Cal, you said that people were trying to participate in liberal democracy. And everyone, maybe I am butchering you guys' statements, but maybe we can flesh that out a little bit more. How has that changed over time, and is there maybe a better way forward?
Forward than what?
So in 1968, we had different groups questioning liberal democracy, and today we have the same thing. We have groups who think we should participate, and others that think we shouldn't.
Right. I did want to go back to the previous thing for 1 second. I would say about the Prague Springs, extremely important event. Not that the others weren't important, but extremely important. And one of the reasons why we call it the new left of the period is because we want to distinguish it from the old left. And the old left referred primarily to the world communist movements, which saw themselves as the inheritors of the Russian Revolution and Stalin's industrialization of the Soviet Union and the spread of that to China and to other parts of the world and to an international movement, international communist movement. And the only real critics of that were Trotskyists, who accepted much of the framework, that is, of Marxism, the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Revolution up to a point. And so the new left was self-described as in opposition to that. And for the most part, it was in opposition to the idea that you could measure, say in the Soviet Union, you could measure socialism by how much steel was produced. This may sound odd, but you could have a conversation and, well, they've got to be an advanced society because look at how much steel they produce, as opposed to socialism being about the liberation of people. And so along with the new left came the idea of a socialist humanism, which was meant really to make the working class something real human beings, not statistics, not something that's confined to economic history or to industrial production, and the backyard furnaces of Mao and so forth. So that's where the idea of the new left came into play. Now, in most of Europe, the new left was socialist and often what was called socialist humanist. In the United States, since we had such a weak communist tradition in the United States, especially as a result of McCarthyism in the 1950s, there wasn't that much of an old left really around. And so the new left was not only then an anti-Stalinist left, but also was a left which was ambiguous. And people like C. Wright Mills, the sociologist, were ambiguous on the subject of socialism itself. And so the early student movement was consciously not socialist. And one of the ideas of the early student movement in this country was that, well, we said we had democracy, we have a formal democracy, but we don't participate in that democracy. We don't have any say in what the rules are and what the outcomes are. And so it was very much a kind of a reformist idea about, to use that word, a reformist idea about liberal democracy. That's the idea really was that in the university in particular, we shouldn't have meetings where people sit at the front at a table and lecture to people sitting in rows in front of us, that we should have a conversation where we're participating. And in the classroom, the students ought to be able to participate. It's very simple, but that's what was the classroom in the university. The students ought to be able to participate in the life of the university. It shouldn't be a strictly bureaucratic or top-down thing. And my point about the unions was that kind of a reformist idea spread into the young people in the unions who said, this is our organization, this union, we ought to be able to participate in it. It ought to be democratic. We ought to have votes. We ought to, and so on and so forth. So I think that it's quite important to think of that kind of a distinction. And it was Prague, especially. Now, you're absolutely right that it happened all over the place and there were antecedents. But in Prague, in 1968, the Prague Spring, for people who had somehow, for one reason or another, had an attachment to the old left, to the idea that Stalinism maybe had its faults, but it had accomplished quite a bit. They had a lot of steel mills and Sputnik, so forth. The Prague Spring really cracked that group of people, because here were young people in Prague, just like young people in Paris or London or Berlin or New York or San Francisco. Here were young people in the streets, and here come the Russian tanks. So that was very important in what the New Left was all about in its own self-definition. It goes back to 56, which is a longer, 1956, and Khrushchev and Hungary, which is a longer issue. But in the United States, it seems to me that unlike in some places in the world, the question of socialism in the 1960s was really left unresolved. Even in SDS in its Maoist stages, last gasps, was not really socialist in a classical socialist sense. Youngsters consider themselves to be anti-imperialist, which is a technical difference, but it had important implications in terms of what you thought about the society that you were living in. So it seems to me that one of the things that the movement of the 60s did not accomplish in this country was any kind of a genuine socialist current within the society, a broader socialist current, which would be part of the conversation. For those of us who are mainly interested in the working class movement, we were not able to, lots of interesting things happened, which I tried to mention, but we did not create a socialist current, something that could hold people and radical ideas, hold on to them through what we didn't know at the time, which was a pretty dreary period that was coming before us. So it seems to me, now I haven't been on campuses for a couple years very often. I go to Berkeley just for other reasons. But I'm told that there's kind of a renewal of socialism amongst young people, or a renewed interest in socialism, and that organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America are making some headway amongst young people. So if I'd be curious to, get some feedback from some of you, not just all questions, about what you're thinking about how to oppose Trump, about what we're going to do with this kind of a malaise we have in the society, and all the economic and social problems that we face and you face for the rest of your lives.
Do you have any other responses to the question?
I wanted to raise one of the panel questions, which is why did separatist politics, right, race, gender, sexuality, black power, feminism, and gay liberation seem to become so salient in the 1960s? Why did there, if indeed these different movements were part of a larger movement, right, that transcended these different sort of struggles for self-determination, what was it that sort of bound these different movements together? I mean, and also there's a discussion about the political crisis, especially the political crisis in Stalinism, is perhaps something that motivated the New Left and gave it form as a response to that political crisis on the left. And is there any relationship perhaps between what would appear to be a fragmentation in the Stalinist left and the new movements that came on the scene in the 60s?
A good place to maybe start with that would be Italy, because the Italian Communist Party under Togliatti came to the conclusion and adopted that in its statutes, that the kind of communism that was being advocated by Moscow, which is how they always referred to it, was not going to be viable for Italy. In 1954, Togliatti makes a very important decision, and that is that in 1954, the Italian Communist Party could have taken power. It was the largest party in the country. It had fought the fascists, it had arms all over the place, and so on. It was really in a position where it could have taken power. And the United States had crushed something like that in Greece, but it would have been much, much harder to crush it in Italy because, of course, it's a much larger country and all kinds of other things. Togliatti made the decision that the communists should take power through democratic means, and in the process move towards something that would be Italian communism, and eventually that became known as Euro-communism, which would be a form of socialism. What the, the red thread in that was uh, the Communist Party in Italy was a very odd alliance between the workers of the industrial north and the peasants of the large plantation-like places in the south. And Gramsci had, of course, theorized that out of prison. He thought about it very, very hard and worked on it. And he was the guiding light for that process. And Togliatti was worried, and the people around him, like Berlinguer, eventually were worried that yes, we could take power, but what would the power that we would exercise? He actually said this in 1954. Would it be the kind of power that we would be proud of exercising? And so he thought that forms of unity should be sought to prevent this kind of fragmentation and so on. And that's why, the Italian Communist Party had very, very difficult relationships with people like Pasolini, who was openly gay, and of course, the Communist Party was against admitting gays as party members, and yet at the same time, they had to accommodate that in somehow. So the uh, the other part, which is this fragmentation, uh, we now have increasingly good scholarship on the role that foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and so on played in the fragmentation and the organization of those groups. The way that the way that the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation helped set up Black Studies at Yale is something that is really very interesting, because now these documents are out in the open, how they actually bought it. Yale had the worst racial relations with its local population, which is primarily an African American population, and in the city of New Haven. And so when the meetings and the demonstrations were taking place, they were really panicking. And Ford said, no, we'll give you money, you'll create these things, we'll create professorships of Black Studies and so on, and you'll give fellowships, and you'll see, you will be in the clear for a number of years. And I think that one thing that needs to be said, and I'm the only one on the panel who is actually in academia, I'm a distinguished professor at this university, but I can tell you that universities were used to suck up all of that revolutionary fervor and disappear. A lot of the people who were in the forefront of the activism of the 1960s, they were young people, but they were not university-based. The intellectuals, people like Sartre and so on, were not university-based. Suddenly, they all were absorbed in universities, and the energy that had been there to transform society was focused on getting tenure, taking over departments, getting more money than, or maybe even, I could go at length about this. Our department will have rugs on its floor as opposed to those people over there who are not going to have it. That was the class struggle in late 1970 within universities. This is something that we really need to be aware of, and you need to be aware of, and that is that you are within institutions that capture that kind of oppositional energy. It's extremely difficult for people in universities to keep a political stance that is not going to be some kind of a cooptation. And this cooptation takes place on a great level. I think that certainly in Europe, but also in the United States. I mean, this happened. Some people avoided it. Let me give you an example. A person whose itinerary is actually quite interesting. Arjen Neijer. Do you know who Arjen Neijer is? He was one of the founders of the SDS, and he was actually brought into the United States as a child by Jewish parents out of Arjen Neijer. Neier. And he was one of the founders of the SDS movement. He was at the Port Huron meeting. He eventually became the chair of the helped create Human Rights Watch. He became president of the ACLU, and he was head of the Open Society Foundation of George Soros for 12 years and doing things all over the place. The man is 80 years old and is still actually very active, and he teaches classes at NYU, which are probably the most progressive classes that are taught, because he's talking about how you can use law to destroy systems. So you have people who have actually an interesting thing, but he's of course somebody that we never talk about. I remember that in one of my classes here, when I assigned a paper that was written by Neier, people said, but it's not even a scholarly paper. There are no footnotes in this damn thing. No, there are no footnotes, but he was talking about something else and very eloquently. I had run into him in the 90s in South Africa when he actually, immediately after the downfall of apartheid, George Soros was putting money into that, and he was administering those programs, and he was doing absolutely remarkable things in Soweto and so on, creating schools. So he was somebody who had found his way during this period of time, and I think that he should be mentioned because we don't have too many heroes over time, and so he is one. I could mention some others.
Interesting time. Maybe we should move on. Are there any other questions?
I could say a little bit about, I think that like women's liberation and black liberation and all those liberation movements are like really, really important. But they also, as you're indicating, can be manipulated by the state, where instead of being a sense of unity and a sense of self-empowerment, which is so vital, can be more of a divisive, divide and conquer aspect. And so I think in the struggle that we're facing right now, one of the things that is happening is there's an attempt, and I think probably all of you have seen this as pretty transparent, that the Democratic Party is trying to immediately latch onto every single social movement that's grassroots. And the idea is that you're going to vote Democrats in, and that's going to be the solution. And it's a danger because a lot of people will, do see that as a hope. When you look at like Trump and you look at Ryan and you look at Pence, and these people are like so crazy. It's easy because of how much media manipulation and what corporate media is presenting as the reality to get sucked up into that and go, oh yeah, if we just vote for the Democrats, then everything will be much better. Which will fund which might buy the capitalists some time, but it. It's ultimately not much of a solution. It certainly makes things a little less disgusting in its face, but the underlying problems of the way society is organized would continue. And so I think that's in conversation with organizing, to bring in the people who are in goodwill, who want the best, but are unaware of the fact that that essentially like corporate Democrats are going to be the solution. But you do see like a struggle in the Democratic Party itself between progressives and corporate Democrats, which is refreshing. But those people outside of the Republican and Democratic Party to have some kind of actual influence in the direction of society, that's the thing that I often wonder about, like what exactly do we do? There's clearly more people are not interested in the Democrats and Republicans than are. It's the majority of people don't trust either party or the policies or the directions that they're going in, but there's no actual bringing together of some program or some actual definite way of instituting what's going on. But there's little bits of it. So the fight for for $15 an hour, you have like all these different little bits, but there's not like a coalition yet of this. And it is interesting that it's finally being called socialism, which is super popular amongst the mainstream of the United States. It's just that the name has been up until recently made ugly, but people do want like frequently universal health care. I think it's way over 50% of America think there should be a single payer system if it was called Medicare for all, things like that. So there's all these like potential solutions, but there's all this noise that the people don't really want it, or or you have the palace intrigue of the hourly Trump meltdown or whatever. So as activists try to bring in the larger population with some kind of focus to ultimately implement, all the things that people really want, but have been told are too radical to have.
I think we did have a question.
I think
Unless there was any
Oh,
other.
can I come in on this? It was one of the. Well, I think I'd have to object to the idea that we could reduce something like the question of women's emancipation, which is a world historic movement, to a conspiracy of the Ford Foundation. And the same thing would go with the fight for black freedom, which is a historic movement, and especially in our own country. And so to reduce a movement like that to a conspiracy seems to me to be quite a huge mistake. I think that also in terms of universities, universities have many natures. They can be conservative, and they can, I said they were elitist, and but they also have been centers historically of dissent and of debate, and certainly have always played an important role in any kind of a movement for change. Universities, it seems to me, have always been important, and as far as the universities in this country in the 1960s, it should be to our great pride that they played, and that the faculty played in the teach-ins, which were so important for the movement in the 1960s, that the faculty members, many of them had the courage to step forward and take part in that. And I don't think that part of our history should be belittled as well. If it's a question specifically about the crisis of identity politics today, that's kind of another story. That's another question which we could talk about. But the development, say, of the Black freedom movement was very much part of a rejection of the old left and of part of the new left. The rejection of the Black movement, of the charge that any kind of a Black movement was communist, the rejection of anti-communism by the civil rights movement in the 50s was extremely important politically. And the same thing happened with the anti-Vietnam War movement. The rejection of anti-communism there, was quite important. The women's movement, the way it came about, has been different in different periods of time. The way it came about in the student movement of the 1960s, which was one source, not the only source, but one source of it, women's liberation then was about inclusion. how can we be included in the movement if we're not treated like first-class citizens? So all the argumentation at the time was about inclusion, not until later, separatism. And the same thing really for the Black movement. The Black movement was about inclusion. How do we find our way into, have a voice in an overwhelmingly white society in which the people who are even contesting that kind of capitalism are overwhelmingly white and have no real idea about what our lives are like, what our history is like, and what we need. And so in that sense, that too was inclusive. How do we get into and become a genuine part of this kind of a society? And this in turn led to big disputes within the socialist movement, within the communist movement, and within the new left, where there were many different points of view on these subjects. And for instance, as any feminist who from that period would tell you, that many of the ideas of women's liberation were not immediately welcomed in the movement of the time. They had to be fought for. And in the same sense, the ideas of Black freedom had to be fought for in the movements at the time. And it doesn't have to be a charge against white people. It doesn't have to be come down to saying that all white people are something or other. But certainly it reflects a real movement, real problems at the time. And so whatever we think about exclusion today, I would have you think about those in terms of inclusion. How does someone who's gay or lesbian, how do they take part in the movement if they can't even say who they are? That's about inclusion.
Let me add one thing, if I may. Actually, two things. I did not mean at all to suggest that it was Ford Foundation or the like that created these movements. What I was describing is how these movements were co-opted and in fact and absorbed, I think that, and how they in fact lost then their roots in their communities and stopped being community organizers. That's what I was trying to suggest. The other thing that I wanted to mention, which has to do with the word socialism. The word socialism is still a word that is actually difficult to use in this country. And what I find interesting is that the word communism is actually now easier to use than the word socialism in this country, especially if you approach it through the ecological movement and the discussion of the common. And in that way, because then people suddenly understand that what is at stake in those terms is a relationship to property, and that whether property is held in common or individual ownership with the legal system. And so I have found actually that with all kinds of people that I talk to who sort of balk at socialism, by now communism has, the kind of Soviet-style communism has been so debunked that the term is actually come back and is kind of clean, and you can actually have a reasonable conversation about it. So, which I think is something that is in many ways encouraging.
Yeah. So, what lessons is like open question? What lessons do y'all think students who are trying to resist like privatization and authoritarianism in the UC system? What lessons do you think we can learn from the student activism of the 60s? Like, especially like organizational lessons.
Yeah. It would be interesting for students to actually study what actually happened during the 60s in the University of California and in California at large. I don't know how, whether you or any of you have actually tried to study what happened at San Francisco State University, which was actually the hotbed of this kind of organization in this area and was extremely important. So I think that the first thing would be to go back to those events and and look at them and because SFSU did something that is worthy of emulation still to today. Whereas if you go back to what happened in Santa Barbara during those days when they blew up a Bank of America building, then you see what is the limitation of that particular thing. So you have different kinds of possibilities. So studying those things within even the state of California, because a lot of those things did happen in California in important ways. You know, the high school protests in LA, and of course the free speech movement that we haven't mentioned yet, which was extremely important. All of that, you know, had a certain kind. It's for every revolutionary movement, you have to have a sense of your genealogy. You have to have a sense of your history. You have to recognize what were the things that worked, what were the things that did not, and how do you how do you learn and how do you implement those things? And you know, I think that on a campus like ours, where it's possible to generate courses through colleges, to have courses in these matters through colleges, since you are not going to get them very easily through departments, because then it has to be approved by the Council on Educational Policy. It will take 2 years, and then make you water down your reading list until there is nothing left. But through those things, you could actually do some very interesting things.
I would say just briefly that to investigate too what is the institution of this university doing to make sure that student activism is not very successful or co-opted in some way, and just to analyze that and then how to overcome that. So there's like this outward kind of media thing that this is like the coolest radicalist school in the world to go to, right? And that's how it's presented. But then once you're here, from what I understand, it doesn't seem like the coolest, most radical university in the world. So my assumption is a lot of students come here thinking it's the most radical, coolest school, and then they think that, well, like maybe skateboarding is the thing or some kind of thing, right? They've got like some kind of like really less than, not a very analytic perspective, not a very looking at it from a social change point of view, and just seeing that, well, we can smoke pot, well, this must be cool, things like that, which are more superficial, but to figure out how to take that information to a larger group of people within the community here. And I do recall when the takeover of I forget the name of the building.
Parallel.
Yeah. That there was frustration that there wasn't a massive amount of students on campus understanding why it was happening, what was going on, why people weren't taking over. And I think part of the thing is so there has to analyze why didn't we get more people going and taking over? Why wasn't there massive popular support? Why didn't schools walk out? Why was there like the blockade of the fish hook? Why was those people marginalized and not taken seriously? Things like that. Whereas on the other hand, you could look at Chile, the student movement there, and its uprisings, or the casserole revolution in Quebec, things like that, where massive student events have happened in the last couple of years. And I was trying to encourage student leaders from those groups to come here and speak to the campus and impart their information. But to look at why didn't those few things that happened in the last 2 years really take off and be something that everybody on campus, or a huge percentage of people on campus, really bought into and thought was important. So maybe the question or the problem was not very well articulated, or too complicated, or somehow didn't really touch the hearts of people on campus. Maybe it was too complex or too esoteric in some way, and people didn't feel it impacted them. And so that would be my suggestion: figure out what is really something that's going to touch people's heart, that will resonate with them, but also would be, meet the ideas that you're trying to achieve.
Is there a DSA on campus? No?
We tried, there wasn't enough news or something. Why do you say? So,
Do people read the magazine The Jacobin? Well, I think, you know, speaking as kind of, it almost sounds like, you know, we're talking about the lonely individual or whatever, but I mean, I think there has to be something that you can relate to that can give you some strength, some education, and if it's not a big group of people, it might be just a smaller group. Once again, you know, it's not something that I've personally ever been involved in the DSA, but from what my kids, you know, they think it's interesting. And the Jacobin is an interesting magazine which covers all kinds of issues I think that young people should be interested in. I think that I don't know what it's like here in terms of your education. You know, when we talk about more individual and personal things, that it's important for young people to reject Silicon Valley and techieism and business and law school, and, and to think about some way that you can support yourself and your family in a life and make a contribution, you know, which I mean, I think not all teachers are great, but teachers do a socially valuable job, and I'm glad to see them getting more money in West Virginia, but I think that would be another thing that I would take into consideration. But I mean, you'd have to check out the other people in this room and find out what they're doing and how they're, you know, dealing with things. There's a long history in the Bay Area now of kind of crazy ultra-leftism, you know, Occupy yesterday, you know, don't do anything else. You know, I wonder about that. Really, the Bay Area ought to be one of the great centers of young people. It has been in the past. I'm not, you know, not quite sure who it is now, but I think there probably at a university like this, there must be many, many people like yourself who are asking those very same questions. And it's kind of finding some of them and getting to talking and working out for yourselves what you might do.
Well, we're approaching 9 o'clock, so I think we can probably think 2 more questions before we can hold to close. So, if I could just get anyone who asks questions currently. It isn't just, oh, in that case, that makes this easier. I guess that'd be
Okay. Given that the new left, with the odds of 1968, could be said to be out ahead 50 years, roughly 50 years after 1917, with the heyday of the old left, do you think that perhaps this could be seen as a parallel situation where the left should not follow old schema put forward by the new left and chart their own course? Or in other words, to what degree should the new left be seen as a model to emulate, and to what degree should it be seen as a cul-de-sac to avoid?
I was trying to suggest something slightly different, and that is that the revolution of 1917 and the other revolutions that took place in the 1920s, the ground for them were laid out in 1848. And so they came 50 years after 1848. And I think that then 1968 was marking the exhaustion of that model, of the industrial model, industrial democracy. And now we are 50 years after 68, and I think that 68 is maturing to the point where it can actually produce the kind of transformation that is needed, building on those ideas, building on the roots that were put at that time. So I would not look at the period between 1917 or 1918, 1968 as marking something, but rather see 17 as in the middle of something, and in a way that then 68 will be the beginning, and we may be now in the middle of something. And so when I was looking at things like the Arab Spring and some of the things that are happening in other parts of the world at the present time, I tend to see it as evidence of something that is happening in the middle of something rather than a new start of some kind.
Well, it's interesting that starting in the early 60s, because of McCarthyism and basically the destruction of the old left in the United States, we thought that we were dealing with this lost generation, this big gap between the 1950s, and that somehow or another we were all out on our own in the 60s. But we're talking about 10 years there now. 68 to now, as we're saying, is 50 years ago. So I think someone would want to be awfully careful before they decided that we could take up things that happened in a pretty different world in the 1960s and apply them in any mechanical way to today. On the other hand, I believe that there is a tradition, a long historical tradition of resistance and revolution, and there's plenty for us to find there to encourage ourselves, to learn about even the Russian Revolution or the 1848 revolution. But in practical terms, it seems to me that we have a very different world. I still think it's a capitalist world. The problem is what to do about capitalism and the fact that it leaves the majority of people excluded and exploited. So we have that same kind of a problem. But I'd be very careful. I think, and maybe things are changing. For a long time, young people got very tired very rapidly of hearing about the 1960s. I don't know if it's still that way or not.
Well, I get the impression, because I work with a lot of college-age students, that the vision of the 60s is that the people now put their own ideas of what happened in the 60s on, I don't know, like there's a vision that you have, because so much has happened between then and how our world is not now, that there's a translation of what the 60s was that is now being molded into your own worldview already. There's like I found that for quite some time, that young people had, idealized a lot of the 60s. For instance, what was spoken about women. There's a huge conflict where, women were expected to go get the coffee and stuff while the men did the real work of the revolution. That was like horribly real rather than just a phony thing. But condition, I think that's what I see. But then this is because I feed homeless people and I'm on the streets all the time with destitute people. It seems like and I don't recall like a massive homeless population living in the United States during 1968. It just didn't seem that way.
It wasn't.
Yeah. Unless I missed something. And so there's more like Depression era, more of a kind of there might be more lessons from the Depression era organizing now than there is from the 60s organizing right now. But the big challenge is that destitute people, which there seems to be a rapidly increasing number of them, who are actually workers, and perceive themselves, like homeless people that I know, identify themselves at the job for which they became injured and then homeless, or found redundant and became homeless, or whatever the thing is. So like if I have a friend who's a master carpenter, but a bunch of things happened. He didn't get union wages anymore. It wasn't worth his while to take this skill. He had family problems, this and that. Now he lives in the streets of Santa Cruz. So people that live that. So somehow to relate to that, and then you have the larger population of the United States, which are people fearing homelessness, basically, even if they're not consciously fearing that. But just trying to stay above water. And so I think there's a whole analysis that somehow we need to come to, which is brand new completely, but where we can learn many lessons. Like recently I've been reading a biography of Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic Workers Movement, and looking at, and then I kept running across these combinations of the National Hunger marches and the bonus march and all those things, and that as a potential strategy. Or there's a lot of people looking at the Poor People's Movement by Martin Luther King and what he was trying to do. Because while people weren't really homeless, there was a massive poor people's movement was necessary to organize around in public housing and so on that was desperate. So so I think it's wide open because we have different technology. We have technology could be shut down. We're like dependent on the government to allow us to do Facebook and stuff all the time. Right now that's being allowed. That can be, as we see, they've shut off all social media in a number of countries in the last week because of the problems that arise from communicating on a mass scale. So I think it's a very creative time, but that we can study a lot of the past, which I think is super, super important. I think that's often been a problem in social movements, that they didn't really know where they came from. Not enough people in them did really have a historic perspective. And at the same time, things are so wide open because of the conditions are completely different now. The economy is organized differently. So obviously, if all the steelworkers went on strike, it would maybe have no impact, because of the global economy and so on, and so many things are different. So we'll have to invent our own new ways of addressing these crises and trying to be as creative as possible. And I think for me, and one of the philosophies of Food Not Bonds was never to be a vanguard, but to create an energy where the new idea comes from that takes off. And I think that's something that can happen now. Look at how fast, like with gun violence, nothing going on. Now massive walkouts everywhere in the country against it. I'm not sure, and it seems like there's a real clear understanding that capitalism is what part of the problem is with gun violence. The students in South Florida are like, making money off of automatic weapons is where the part of the problem lies. Now, if they see that this exploitation and profit-driven in general, or just automatic weapons in specific, it would be interesting to see. But you get a sense that the people have a pretty large understanding of the connection between the NRA making a lot of money, advocating for the sale of more guns, and that's what it's just a gun version of selling hamburgers and selling stocks and stuff like that.
So there's, I guess, a lot of, if you started up talking about how spontaneous 1968 seemed to be, there wasn't any orchestration, things were happening, people were talking in ways they hadn't talked before. And we've just read, we have a reading group and we read Second International authors. We just read Luxemburg on the mass strike and Trotsky on the results and prospects. So just to follow up to Evan's question about this sort of the long sweep of history, thinking about the relationship between 1848 and 1917, or 1848 and 1905, as Trotsky does in Results and Prospects. I guess the lesson for Trotsky, 1905 affirms Marx for Trotsky because I guess he's thinking about 1905 is an advance on 1848. There's something that's changed that has allowed for the sort of build-up of the Second International, the mass parties of the Second International, and then that sort of sets the stage for, testing out this Marxist hypothesis of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so then thinking about the relationship between 1968 and today, where we haven't necessarily had the buildup, but we certainly haven't had the buildup of mass parties in the interim, but something has happened. What is the spontaneity if we are to experience another spontaneous moment today, right? Are there preconditions for that even happening?
Well, the industrialization lent itself to the creation of mass parties because labor was organized almost on military grounds, and so it was easy to think of mass parties also well organized with workers' discipline and so on. Those were the slogans essentially that you had during the organization of the labor movement in much of the 19th century, and they were especially pushing away at the utopian socialists who actually were much more spontaneous about this kind of organization. 1968 was not about parties, it was about movements. But the notion of movement is something that we actually don't really have a very good analysis of at the present time, because some people invoke the term to simply have something that crystallizes around a single issue. And then when that issue is handled, it kind of dissolves. But one of the things that was so important about what was happening in 68 was that the movement was multifaceted. And so, yes, it was anti-imperialist. Yes, it was anti-totalitarian. Yes, it was anti-communist, and so on and so forth. And that's why in my initial remarks, I said there was a cultural dimension, there was a social dimension, an economic dimension, and a political dimension. And it's only really the cultural dimension that has really run its course, but those others are still to run its course. But all of the talk that took place in the 70s about self-management and the organization of the workplace, the operaismo in Italy that was being done, and so on. Those things, have not yet been really truly analyzed and looked at as the basis of something that would be viable. And that's what I mean about how that still being just reaching its maturity. It's not exhausted. It was repressed, it was co-opted and so on, but it was not exhausted. There's still life in those ideas.
Do we have any other comments?
Spontaneous is spontaneous. You don't know when it's going to happen. You don't know when the West Virginia teachers are going to walk out and win something. No one saw it coming. Maybe some people in West Virginia did. So lots about 68 was spontaneous. Who would have thought that there would be a general strike in France? I guess one of the questions really always has been, how does the left, or how do socialists, or how do whatever, take advantage of spontaneous developments so that they become more than a flash in the pan, more than something that comes and goes, the way many things do in our lifetimes, the way many things in the past period have come and gone, and nothing seems to be left behind them. So that seems to be one of the questions. To me, that inevitably takes us in the direction of some kind of organization, unless one's a pure anarchist. Some kind of an organization, and then the problem is, well, what kind of an organization, and the social. You mentioned the Second International that seemed to have cracked under the weight of the war. Was it inevitable that it would have? Well, I don't know. The alternative put forward by Trotsky is something else again. Seems to me we have a lot of experience with that now. The idea that we can take something that happened literally 100 years ago and use that as kind of a roadmap and as something that is of universal applicability, no matter where you are, what stage of development you are, wherever you still have this mechanical idea of revolution. So, I don't, but so I would say, not being an anarchist, I would say that, the question is organization. What kind of an organization? What kind of an organization can be democratic? What Rosa Luxemburg, raised was, the ideas of democracy within the mass party and the mass strike, and then within the Russian Revolution. The idea of democracy was not an idle question as far as the Russian Revolution was concerned, because it very quickly was no longer a democratic experiment, democratic revolution. So that's what I would say. I don't know that anyone really has the experience or the knowledge that they could sit here, even like us, and say, here's what we need in terms of organizations. And organizations develop, and can develop spontaneously as well, and differently in different places. Because there's a movement in Spain that seems very positive, it doesn't mean it's what we need here in the United States. That seemed to me to be self-evident, except people get ideas in their head that there ought to be a one-size-fits-all answer. It makes it easier to all questions. But so I would say we have to be aware of the question of organization of students, of organization of workers, of organization in society. Should women be organized? Should black be organized? If so, how? Those are the things that I think we ought to be concerning. It's things we ought to be concerning ourselves with when we're also concerned about what's going on in the world.
So we may be, like in 10 years from now, you may be looking at now as that spontaneous event in history, right? But it might not, while you're actually living it, seem to be that spontaneous event. So, there was certainly a sense that when the Arab Spring started, there was a lot of hope for people seeing social change, and you had all kinds of radical things happening globally at that time. And then we saw how quickly they were either co-opted or crushed or changed in many, many ways. And I think an interesting thing, Tunisia, for example, there was this huge, that was put up as being this great change, that they threw out the dictator, and they didn't have the mass violence that they had in Egypt, and having a dictator return immediately. And it's supposedly a free country now after this revolution. But there's a huge protest on the streets because the economic question was never resolved, and people were really poor, and the original sparks in part for that revolution, which were economic and based, just that never became the reality. And so it's an ongoing thing that there's can be positive change for a while, then maybe because of what happened in part between the combination of the strike in West Virginia and the Enough is Enough and the women's movement that has rekindled because of the Harvey Weinstein scandal and all that, we might be seeing the beginning of this huge thing, but we won't know. Maybe it will just become like a capitalist media fiasco, and successfully co-opted, or maybe it will actually be the foundations for real change. And I think we have to be open to the reality on the ground is what's going on, and trying to physically get groups together to come up with some kind of principles and organizational structure and figure out some kind of strategy that really works and all those things. Those are all still up in the air because everything is so fluid. Anyway, but it seems to be particularly wide open right now as to what could possibly happen. And we don't know, like people are waiting for economic crisis, the way things are organized, Maybe there's like massive, even worse, instead of the slow displacement of millions of Americans into poverty, it becomes like a huge nightmare like in the Great Depression or something. We just don't know what kind of, or maybe Trump is so crazy he does blow up North Korea or whatever the thing is. Organizing our own communities and our own selves in a sustainable way over a long period of time, and with some kind of shared vision that you yourselves create and can be adapted to whatever the conditions are that are changing very quickly. So that would be what's important. But I definitely, you may find like a really good thing that comes from one revolutionary period of thought and literature, and maybe something from some other tendency actually makes more sense for right now. Maybe it inspires you to think of a whole nother new way of organizing that has never been thought of before. Because after all, those other ways of organizing were thought of by somebody originally and created. So that would be my sense of things. I think it's very exciting right now, and we could well be in the middle of, look at people, your grandkids will go, wow, what was it like in 2018? It was so amazing.
I think with that we can bring the panel to a close. We'd like to thank the panelists for coming to participate on the panel. Of course, this panel was organized by the Platypus Society on campus. We hold reading groups and coffee breaks weekly. And if you're interested in participating in those where we continue discussions about the left, then we have a sign-up sheet. Someone will put your email on the email list for that. I think also, Keith Begani also has some papers up here for your organization, Student Law. I think also we'd like to thank everyone in the audience for attending as well.